So we're talking this week about the idea of upwards. I'm going to read us a passage from the Bible. It's a book called Joshua. Now, history, tradition would say this book was written by, take a guess, Joshua. Of course, he put his name on the book. Most of the books in the Bible don't actually contain any information about who wrote them. When we want to find out who wrote them, we're talking about tradition, we're talking about research. But it's quite rare, especially in the Old Testament, that people say, hey, my name is so-and-so, I'm writing this book. Same with the writers of the stories about Jesus. It's tradition. They very rarely said, this is who's writing this book. The only one that really that is the case with is John. But Matthew, Mark, Luke were working back and were saying, hey, it looks like, given the history and the tradition, this person wrote this book. Same with Joshua. And so we're going to start with Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. If you have a Bible you'd like to open and follow along, you're more than welcome to. This isn't going to come on the screen right now, so just absorb it. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river of the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the laws my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Think about it day and night, so you might be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Let's pray. God, as we dip into this text, as we think about our community, about times of transition and change, thank you that you are with us. You take the words that will come out my mouth, the meditations of my heart, but use them for your glory, God. May they be pleasing to you. Amen. So, great to see you guys this morning. If you're visiting, my name is Alex. I'm one of the pastors here. I just want to say thank you to Jean for leading us in worship this morning. It was just wonderful to have you here, just to bring that sense of that love that you have for God. So we're so grateful to you for being here today. Thank you. We're walking through a series on transitions. We're going through a time as a church where we're moving from a lead pastor that we said goodbye to a few weeks ago, and we're moving into whatever God has for us next. And anytime you do that, that brings emotion. It brings that sense of, wow, what's going on here? Last week, the image I gave you, the sort of metaphor, was of me surfing in the Atlantic Ocean and having those moments of wiping out because I wasn't particularly good at surfing. It happened regularly, and getting tumbled by a wave and having no sense of, like, where am I? Where's the ocean floor? Where's the surface? And getting up and getting that big gasping breath because you knew that another wave could wipe you out again straight afterwards, and it could go wave after wave after wave. And we talked about this idea that change has that way of being disorientating. Change can bring this sense of loss, and loss leads to grief, and grief disorientates us. Perhaps another metaphor I might give you is the one of skiing. We're probably more mountain country here than ocean country. You guys have seen the mountains. Maybe you've been on them. Maybe you're skiers yourself. I had this passion for big country skiing. Just before we found out that we were having our first child, Elena, I went out and I bought some ski boots. I already had some, but it was a source of contention because I spent a little more than I told my wife originally that I was going to spend, somewhere around double what I told her I was going to spend, just a little more. Now, technically, it was a technicality because really it included all the insoles and all that kind of stuff and the fitting, and you can't really include that in the total of the boots, but regardless, I went and bought them because I wanted to do this big backcountry skiing. Of course, when we found out our first daughter was on the way, that went the same way as motorcycles and other things that guys might find enjoyable, and it was a no. But when you get caught in an avalanche, what I learned as I was preparing for these kind of trips was an avalanche is disorientating too. You get tumbled up and down, and then if you survive, you have this moment where you're like, what do I do next? And your instinct is to crawl whichever way you feel might be upwards. But the problem is the avalanche itself is so disorientating, you may be crawling in completely the wrong direction. In actual fact, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to clear a little space, and you're supposed to spit. You allow the spit to drop from your mouth, and the spit will, of course, follow gravity and go down, and you climb or push snow the other way, theoretically to safety. But if all you do is just say, right, we're going to go, the chances are you could easily be going in the wrong direction. When you experience an event like change, like loss that leads to grief, the disorientation is so great, just starting off and saying, we're going to do some stuff, actually isn't the best idea. So last week we looked at the idea, let's take a week to acknowledge grief. Let's go backwards. And we didn't just talk about this in the sense of our community, we talked about it in our lives in general. So many of you guys will have experienced grief. Maybe you're experiencing it right now. Actually taking a chance to say, man, that really hurt. I lost someone or something that was important to me. And I'm acknowledging that now is a good thing. It's good to take that time. Maybe after processing for a little while, you get to do that thing of being thankful and saying, oh, I'm so thankful I had that. I'm so thankful for the way this person spoke into my life, the way that God gifted this person to me. Those are good things. That retrospective thing is important. And it affects a community just as much as it affects us as individuals. We looked last week at how when a company loses a CEO, they can experience sales loss, maybe even 60, 70% of their sales disappear. So many companies close down within weeks of losing or months of losing a founding CEO. Churches, the hardest part for a church to go, the hardest time for a church to go through is the loss or death of a founding pastor. So often things just don't stay the same. So we want to take this process seriously. We spent a week looking backwards, and that's good. But then that leaves us with this little bit of a tension. Because for me, as someone who gets to come in and work here and to help lead this community, there's a couple of questions. Firstly, do you change everything? Well, that's not a great thing to do, is it? I mean, think about all the people that are going through grief. If I just come in and say, hey, I'm ready for change, I'm ready for new things, then for some people, there's a whole load of mini funerals to take place first. There's this sense of, change is hard and I need to process that. Changing everything isn't a good plan. But the other alternative maybe seems to change nothing. And then what happens? Because any time you walk through a change like this, there's a group of people that are like, oh, I've been ready for some change. I've noticed a couple of things that I would like to have changed, and now there's this transition. It feels like this is a good time, like we should jump on this and we should build some momentum and we should go. And that's not great either, because if we say to those people there's no change, well, then they feel kind of stagnated. I've been connected with a couple of churches just by chance that have been through that process. I went and interviewed with a large mega church about 4 or 5 years ago. And this church had been pastored by an incredible teacher. It had built to gigantic size, and now they'd gone through a time of transition. And it felt, when you walked in, like there was this stagnation. It felt like there was something just not quite right about the place. I kind of had this suspicion that he still had his office set aside somewhere in the building, that maybe it was slowly gathering dust, like there was a chair that no one was allowed to touch. Maybe the bathroom stall that he last blessed with his presence was still like there just waiting. It had that sense to it of this is a community that just hadn't been able to move on from this loss. And still, 4 years later, they were still talking about, oh, wasn't it great? Wasn't it great when so-and-so was here? I'm not going to say his name. I know loads of you that are into that kind of thing would want me to say his name. But there's that sense of, wasn't it great back then? Can't we go back to those days? When a community doesn't move forward, eventually it just stagnates, and it starts to smell a little bit. It starts to have that sort of funk to it that you're like, as a new person, I don't want to be a part of this. So we're stuck in that sense of, we need to look backwards and grieve, yes. But we also need to get to that point of being able to move forwards and say, God, what do you have for us as a community? And this is where the key of looking upwards comes in. The first direction is backwards to grief. The second direction is upwards. It's this sense of looking to this God who is the center of this community. And that's exactly what Joshua does at this time of change. Look at this first part of the passage. This is what Joshua does. He jumps on this idea of we're going to explore looking upwards. Joshua chapter 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aid, Moses, my servant, is dead. The first thing that we see Joshua do is get into a place where he can converse with God. He can have that conversation. Now, I'm going to use the language upwards quite often. And the reason I'm going to do that is because the Bible, for the most part, is very comfortable with the language of a three-tiered worldview. So what do I mean by a three-tiered worldview? For years and years and years, people had this understanding of how the world worked. You had the sort of like the middle part, which is where we are now. So I used a picture of the Shire to help us understand that because I'm a huge Tolkien fan. There we go. We got the middle part, so you had Earth that was there. That's the area we walked on. And then you had the heavens, which were above us. So there we go. We've got the heavens, and they're above, and so you've got tier one, a tier here, and then you've got a tier here. And then you had something that was under us that nobody really liked to talk about. You had the hell, the Hades, the whatever language you used that was underneath. And so they had this very definite sense of up there is God, down there is something else, and on the middle, that's where we walk. Now, fortunately for us as people today, that's still stuck in our language. You guys would still use language like this all the time. Think about just the way that you might say a blessing before grace. You might look upwards. Some of you may still make the sign of the cross. You see baseball players. I've got the Titanic Gleyber Torres here, who's hitting bombs for the New York Yankees regularly and often. He's hit about 50 against the Baltimore Orioles alone, I think, this year. And every time he does it, you see him. He has this little sign. He looks upwards. He points. He's recognizing and thanking God for the gift that he's been given to hit baseballs really far and really hard. And that's his way of responding. But it might be that you're sitting listening and you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. There's no sort of heavens directly above and there's no hell below us. That got blown out about 100 years ago. The moment Yuri Gagarin broke through the stratosphere and looked out and said, I don't see God, that brought that into question. The moment that we got this understanding of the core of the earth and we dug down, we did explorations, we found that there was no literal hell below us. So for some people, that can be a problem, right? It can be a problem with the fact that the Bible talks about up and down, and we scientifically know that it's not the case. What I would say is this: the Bible chooses to use the language of the people that wrote it. It's very comfortable talking about God is up and hell or death is down. But there's plenty of times where the Bible questions that idea, even if it doesn't change the language that it uses. Check out these couple of passages from the Psalms. There's almost this humorous way that God deals with it. This is what the Lord says: heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? Where is my resting place? It's this sense of like God's largeness. You can't define him by saying he's just in heaven and he's not on earth. It's this sort of ironic sense of, man, if heaven's my throne, my feet are on the earth. There's this kind of way of questioning the language. It's saying that God is bigger than all of that language we might use. Check out this other verse. This is one of my favorite Psalms, 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. This writer David, going through that sense of who am I as a human, comes to this conclusion: it doesn't matter. Down in the ground, God is there. Up in the sky, God is there. On this middle territory, God is there. If I go as far as I can, east or west, there, God, I am still in your presence. So while the Bible will be comfortable using language of God is up, something else is down, it actually critiques that idea pretty strongly when you actually look at the details. This God is everywhere. So when we talk about upwards, we'll keep using the language, that's fine. But what I really mean by upwards is Godwards. Joshua's first movement is to look Godwards. He has this moment where it's disorientating, a moment where Moses has gone, and now there's this sense of, what's next. And he chooses not to move, but he chooses to pause. If you've ever read the Psalms in the Bible, there's this word that comes up occasionally that nobody really quite understands. There's all these questions about it. It's this word Selah. And really what it is, it's a pause. It's a kind of take a minute, think about that. Just stop a second. That's what it means. And this is what Joshua chooses to do in the midst of change. He chooses to stop and say, I'm going to look Godwards for just a second. Next slide. And he learned this from Moses. He learned it from Moses. Moses has these moments where it looks like he's going to lead this group of people. We talked last week about how he brought them out of Egypt. He rescued them from slavery. God used him to do these incredible things. And now they're stuck in a desert. They're getting this sense of identity. They've been given these laws. They're starting to learn who they are. But it looks like Moses will have a chance to lead them into what's called the promised land, this area of land that they've been told God is going to give you. You will have this as your own. But Moses starts to get suspicious about what's going on. He has these amazing personal conversations with God where he really actually, he challenges God. He's like, I'm not convinced that you're giving me the whole deal here, God. Moses said to the Lord, you've been telling me lead these people, but you haven't let me know who you'll send with me. You've said, I know you by name and you have found favor with me. If you're pleased with me, teach me your ways so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. Next slide. Then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? And the Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name. Then Moses said, now show me your glory. What an amazing conversation where a human being is willing to push back in conversation with the divine. There's this sense of God, you've been saying go, you've been saying there's a future, you've been saying take this journey, but you haven't committed to being there. There's been a conversation about I'll send an angel with you or something like that. And Moses' response is, no, unless you come, I'm not interested. Unless you go, there's no point. We'll just cancel the whole thing. I would say a church in transition gets to ask some of the same question. If God is not here, then why? Why carry on? You can find community somewhere else. I've had conversations with people regularly about how sometimes church is a hard place to find community. I've found sometimes better community at the gym. I've seen people find better community in social clubs. So if it's just for that reason, then we could just cancel the whole thing and close the building. There's this sense of, God, if you're not there, why carry on? Moses has chosen to pause and ask that hard question, and Joshua has learned from Moses. I'm going to pause. And I'm going to ask that question. God, is your presence here with us? Now I'm intrigued because I don't know about you, but I don't do this. I'm terrible at doing this. I love movement. So if I see change, I'm like, let's go and move. To me, to stop and say, I'm going to listen and wait for God is a super hard thing to do. I have to intentionally train myself to do it. There's this thing that I've done occasionally that might help you. When I do a time of prayer, what I do is I do this thing called palms down, palms up. And I'll sit there and I'll turn my palms upside down and put them on my knees. And I'll intentionally choose to give all the nonsense that's built up in me, all the sense of my own importance, all the sense of my own wisdom, and I'll lay it down. And I won't change position until I've let go of that. And then I turn my hands and I say, God, now I'd like to hear from you. Let me hear from you. Let me know your presence. But that to me is an intentional act. It's so hard for me to do easily and regularly. Why do you think that is? I'm not sure. I would ask you, if you think about your own life, think about when you're not working or intentionally playing, what is it that occupies your mind most of the time? For me, I would say stuff like ESPN, stuff like the sports game, Ron dropped over to pick up a guitar the other day, and we just blasted into a 15-minute conversation about fantasy football. We had names flying out of our mouths. We just knew it. We were just immersed in it. Sometimes what immerses us makes a difference. Moses, Joshua, these people were immersed in the presence of God. And for me, that process is difficult. I think we can understand this a little bit by the weird celebrity culture that America has. Britain too, I guess. There's this sense of we now have all these people that are famous just for being famous, which probably wasn't true, 15, 20 years ago. But when you think about meeting a famous person, it only really matters if you have a value on that person, right? If you don't have a value, you just don't notice. I was walking down the street of my hometown just before we moved to America, actually, and as I'm walking there, I see this big crowd of people. And I look over, and there's this guy coming out of the door. I've got a little picture of him here. Here he is. Now, some of you know who he is, some of you don't. It's Simon Cowell. He's on X Factor, American Idol. Of all people, when we're talking about being famous just for being famous, this is the guy, right? He's made millions of dollars on other people's talent. Like, I should learn that art. I don't have any talent, but I can make money off other people's talent. It's a genius business model. Take other people that are good at stuff, get them to do the stuff they're good at, get the money. Wonderful. And so if you're not sure, you can't see that distant picture, here's a picture of him a little closer up, and you may recognize him. There he is, smiling smugly because he's so rich from other people. And there's this sense of like, the people had stopped. He had this huge Rolls Royce parked outside, and there was this crowd of people just waiting to grab autographs. Simon, 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 Simon. Now, that only matters if you care who Simon Cowell is and think he's valuable. For every celebrity story where someone talks about, wow, I met so-and-so, there's probably 10 missed celebrity stories where you walked past someone who was famous, who was supposedly a big deal, and you didn't even notice they were there. When I used to work on the golf courses back in England, there was a guy who worked with us who he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, to say it politely, and he'd been given a job as a doorman in a brand new club that opened in Birmingham in the 70s. And if you've heard Ozzy Osbourne speak, that's not drugs, that's actually what people from my hometown sound like. They've got this kind of like, hello, yeah, I know, I'm Ozzy Osbourne, and that's what we sound like. It's unfortunate. And so Gary sounds a bit like that as well. So he stood on the door of this brand new club, and the manager comes down to Gary and says, Gary, no one else comes in tonight. We're busy, we're full. Gary looks at him and says, all right, boss, no worries. And then about 5 minutes later, this enormous Rolls Royce pulls up outside. And this guy climbs out. This is the 70s in Birmingham. It's a guy called Steve Winwood. Some of you may have heard of him. Some of you may not care, but he's at the time a very famous musician, had done some really cool stuff. He played with Hendrix, he played with Billy Joel, all these other people. And Steve Winwood is used to getting into anywhere he wants to go, so he strides out of this Rolls Royce and walks confidently towards the door of the club. And Gary looks at him and says, sorry, mate, we're full. And Steve Winwood kind of pauses and says, it's awkward, I'm Steve Winwood. Gary says, I don't care who you are, mate, we're full, you're not coming in tonight. and so Steve Winwood walks back to his Rolls Royce, gets in, and drives off. Gary stands there smug at having done his good job. He's a great doorman. About 5 minutes after that, the manager walks down, comes over to Gary and says, Steve Winwood turned up yet? Gary says, yeah, he did. I told him to get lost, we're full. And the manager's like, oh, unbelievable. Like, I asked this guy to come and appear as a favor to me. He's a friend. I was going to tell everyone that my club opened this week, and Steve Winwood was there, like, in the midst. He was there making it happen. And Gary just didn't get it. For every celebrity story, there's a story of a missed celebrity encounter, someone that you just didn't care about. What I would say is your excitement about that celebrity is directly linked to the value that you place on them. We should have a slide for that next one, I think, guys. Excitement or interest are directly related to value and awareness. The same is true about this process that Joshua and Moses are going through. This encounter thing, this moment of God's presence, it's directly related to our interest, our value, and our awareness. And the truth is, for you and I, if we're honest, we're not very good at being aware. And sometimes there's so many things going on, choosing to be interested is really difficult. Choosing to be interested is really difficult. There's everything to take care of. There's school, there's work, there's what our kids are up to, there's driving constantly up and down highways in rush hour, getting people to different things. Taking the time to be interested can be a really difficult thing. Next slide, please, guys. And yet Joshua is. And he's interested because of just how transformational finding out about this God has been for this community of people. This passage, we've talked about it before, is like, I call it like a Grand Central Station passage. Grand Central Station is like a hub that so many lines come through. And this is a Bible passage that you might end up coming back to time and time again because it's just so transformative. It's such a big deal. This is God telling the people of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 6, this is who I am. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It starts off Shema, Ye Israel Adonai, Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It's this sense of like God is big and God is just one. Now that to us seems like a really normal thing. Of course God is one. We're brought up in this monotheistic Judeo-Christian culture. But to these people, the fact that God would reveal himself like this was huge. Because think about where they lived. They lived in a culture where there were loads of gods. When you walked down to the stream to get water, you had to walk through the woods and you had to worry about the woodland god because you needed to keep him happy. And then you might walk through a field and then you had to worry about the god of the harvest and you had to make sure you didn't annoy him. And then you had to worry about the river god because the river god was dangerous as well. And you had to make all these different sacrifices to all these different gods and you had to keep all of them appeased. And it was difficult. It was constantly on your mind. And then to make it even worse, they had this thing called henotheism. So it wasn't just about the river and it wasn't just about the field and it wasn't just about the woods, but it was also about the particular area or territory that you lived in. The gods of Egypt were more powerful in Egypt than they were outside of Egypt. And the gods of Canaan were more powerful in Canaan than they were anywhere else. And everyone had this home and away kind of field advantage. And this is how people thought. So for a God to say, I am one God, and it doesn't matter where you are, and it doesn't matter whether you're in a field or a stream or wherever else, this was groundbreaking. This was huge. And when they found out just how big this God was, it captured their attention like nothing else. This God mattered in a way that no other God had claimed to matter before. So when they get stuck in transition, when they get lost, their immediate reaction is, we just go to our God, because our God is huge. You get that in Moses' language, don't you? If you go with us, it doesn't matter where we go. If you go to the next thing and you're there, man, we don't need to worry. It doesn't matter if we're in Canaan all of a sudden. It didn't matter that we were in Egypt. You were bigger than the Egyptian gods. It doesn't matter that we're going to Canaan. You'll be bigger than the Canaan gods. So long as God was present, none of that stuff mattered. You could rely on the harvest because this God managed the harvest too. You could rely on the rains coming because this God managed the rains as well. You could rely on everything because this God superseded every other God you'd ever heard about. When they heard, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, it wasn't just, oh yeah, that's a nice passage. It was like, wow, that is mind-blowing. This is the kind of celebrity status, if you want to use that awful word about God, that this God had. He had this draw to this people of like, this is incredible news. Next slide, please, guys. I would say that for us as a community, this God and our focus on him brings that surprising reorientation we were talking about last week. If you weren't here, we talked about disorientation, yes, but we talked about encounter with this God can lead to this surprising reorientation. It's suddenly like, wow, we suddenly have this sense of where we're going because we chose to focus in the right direction. There's this theory about sort of land organization that the whole of the earth is shifting. That where once was north is no longer the true north. If you look at the magnetic pole versus the true pole, it's actually shifting all over the place. Soon we won't actually be able to get a direct sense of where that is. Now, it's not going to matter to people like you and I because most of us don't go to the North Pole very regularly. But it's a scientific concept. When we have this sense of pause, I think it gives us this sense of this is our true north. This is this God that pulls everything towards him. He will direct us as to where to go. Next slide, guys. And you can keep going. That was from the last one. There we go. And this is where Joshua lands. He takes this second to pause. He takes this breath. He encounters this God, and this is where this God will lead him. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Suddenly, the next thing, this God has promised to be involved in as well. And we as a community need to know that before we move forward. I've been working with my kids, as you would expect, helping them to sort of understand that they're safe. We've had different levels of childhood. Some of them are going through stages where their dreams are more vivid than before. Little Jude, at 20 months old, is suddenly, he wakes up and he has these kind of night terrors because he suddenly realizes he's alone. And as I was reading about different theories, I was reading about what to say and what not to say. So my instant reaction is when one of my kids says to me something about a monster, like maybe under the bed or something like that. My instant reaction is to say, there's no monsters. They're not real. And then someone said something to me that made me think. They said, well, hold on a second. Have you ever thought about the fact that they might really believe the monsters are there? So you saying that there's no monsters doesn't tell them that there's no monsters. It just tells them that you don't know about the monsters. They don't feel safe. They feel like you're suddenly less powerful than they saw you as before. So I started telling my kids that Daddy eats monsters. Because I thought, that will be fine then. They'll be like, we're safe. And I'm not sure it's the right thing to do. To be honest, all of my parenting is complete. Like, I get wisdom from Laura, and the rest of it, I just wing it. I figure it out as we go. But that's what I tried doing. I told them, Daddy eats monsters. Because what I realized is they needed to know that I could handle whatever was going to come up. If they woke up in the night and there was this incredibly scary monster, they knew that I had it covered. It wasn't that I was blissfully unaware. It wasn't that I was stuck in a distant room and not able to help. They needed to know I had direct influence over the situation. This is what God does for Joshua and this group of people. He's not distant. I will be with you. I'm not just in it for the short haul. I will never leave you or forsake you. This God will go with them. What presence brings, what that pause for upwards, for Godwards brings, is the what's next. It leads you to begin to plan for the future with that sense of safety, that sense of, I have you covered. God eats monsters for breakfast. It doesn't mean that they don't appear. It doesn't mean that it's not scary, but it does mean that he's with you in the situation. This is where Joshua lands. Upwards leads to forwards. It leads to what's next. And when we know that God is in our what's next, it changes everything. But for us, a first step is that upwards. It's that acknowledging that sometimes our awareness and value on that presence are a problem. Sometimes there's so many things going on that it's hard to focus. Sometimes, if we're honest, we're still in that zone of figuring it out. We're still figuring out, why does the Bible talk in a three-tiered worldview? Why is it talking about heavens up there when I know that there's no up there? We're still figuring that out. But I've always said to people, as they're in that figuring it out stage, it's fine to figure it out, but don't use it as a pretense. I used to, when I worked with students, work with all these intelligent 18-year-olds. They were brilliant. They had this sense of like, I'm asking all these questions. And I always say, don't use questions as an excuse, because I've met hundreds of people that started asking questions at 18 and never really got down to the business of trying to figure it out. Questions were just an excuse to go do whatever you wanted to do. But when we have this sense of value for this God, when we're genuinely seeking to get that sense of his presence, when we're genuinely seeking upwards before forwards, it can take effort. And so that's why I want to bring us back to that thing that I talked about earlier, palms down palms up. God gave spiritual disciplines so that we could learn to know him better. Wise people, far wiser than you and I, for thousands of years have shaped these things. So I'm going to invite Jean to come back and lead us in a last song before I pray. But we're going to take a second before that prayer to take that palms down, palms up. So what I'd love you to do, if you want to, if you don't want to, it's fine. We're going to close our eyes. And as a community, we're just going to take a moment to think about everything that takes our attention. The sports articles, the world news, all those different things. A focus on our family that's important, but can at the time just be a thing that stops us getting to that sense of, God, you're here with me. We're just going to take our palms and we're just going to put them downwards. And we're just going to choose in this moment to let go. To choose to enter into this discipline that's hundreds of years old, that thousands, millions of people have done at different points. We're going to say, God, all the things that I hold so strongly, all the things that keep me from you, I choose in this moment to let go. And that's a decision. It's not an emotion. You don't have to feel like you've let go. It's this sense of, I am choosing, God, to let go. Maybe just for this moment. Maybe you'll be tempted to pick them back up as you walk out the door. That's okay. Maybe on the drive home, they start to circle back through your mind. This is a learned behavior. But as we let go, we then get to turn our palms upwards and say, God, I long for your presence. In a moment of transition, I choose to pause. To say, God, if you are not here with us, it is not worth opening the doors. There are better social clubs out there. But for your presence we long. God, we choose to surrender and choose to invite you in. So often we miss you in amongst all the details of getting here on time. For those of us that are here early in the morning, we lose you in the details of sound desks that don't cooperate, lyrics that seem to have disappeared for songs, cameras that seem to buzz, lights that suddenly don't work. Those details can just swarm around and take away the sense that, God, it's about your presence. God, in this moment, we choose to be present to you, knowing that if you go with us, it changes everything. God, if you don't go, we don't want to go. How will anybody know that we are your people and you're pleased with us if you don't go with us? We pray for a community where people can walk in and feel a sense of peace, feel that they can belong, feel that they are welcome regardless of what's going on in their lives. From the worst to the best of us, may people feel welcome. God, we pray for lives that will be transformed. As we go forward, we pray that there will be a sense that the hopeless can become hopeful again, that the lost could feel found, that the hurting and broken could find healing. Thank you for your presence that makes those things possible. Your presence has led blind men to see, lame men to walk, dead men to rise. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.